So what happens when an entire generation feels like it's been let down by history? For a bunch of young Greeks in the 80s and 90s, the answer wasn't in politics. Not really. It was in the pages of comic books. Yeah, you heard that right. Let's get into this.
You know, this lyric from the Greek rock band Fat May just hits the nail on the head. Lukewarm. It's not cold apathy, but it's not hot-headed passion either. It's this cautious, maybe even disappointed feeling that just perfectly captured the mood of a generation caught between the failed promises of the past and a future they weren't so sure about.
And that really is the big question here, isn't it? When you lose faith in all the big isms, socialism, capitalism, you name it, where do you even turn to figure things out? Well, for them, the answer started bubbling up from this really vibrant, kind of subversive counterculture. All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get into what made this generation feel so betrayed and talk about the post-dictatorship hangover. Then we're heading straight to the heart of the counterculture in Exarcheia Square. From there, we'll zoom in on two amazing artists, Dimitris Vitalis and Soloúp, before we wrap things up by unpacking the whole Generation X paradox.
Okay, so before we can even talk about the comics, you gotta understand the historical whiplash that Greece was going through at the time. It was a lot. I mean, just try to imagine growing up through this timeline. First, in 74, you have this incredible, explosive hope after a brutal dictatorship finally falls. Then the socialists come to power, promising this huge, radical change. But by the time the late 80s roll around, that whole dream has just curdled into corruption. And this is happening at the exact same time the Berlin Wall is falling and ideologies are collapsing everywhere. It was the perfect storm for some serious cynicism. And all this gave birth to what's called the Metapolitefsis Generation. It literally means the generation after the junta. This was Greece's Gen X. And what defined them wasn't so much what they believed in, but, well, all the things they'd stopped believing in.
So here's the key thing to get. They were skeptical of pretty much everything. Political parties, their parents' old school values, the church, you name it. A lot of people accuse them of just being conformists with no ideals. But what was really happening was they were trying to build a new identity from the ashes of all that disillusionment.
So, with all this skepticism and distrust in the air, where does a generation like that find an outlet? Turns out, the answer was in one specific neighborhood in Athens, and in one very cool art form. Exarcheia Square. Even today, it's known as the heart of Greek counterculture. Back in the 80s, it was the perfect incubator for this new wave of artists and thinkers who just felt totally alienated from the mainstream. It was, a place for the people who didn't quite fit in anywhere else. And in Exarcheia, magazines like Vavel and Parapente became the voice of this whole scene. At first, they were just translating cool European comics, but pretty soon they were just flooded with work from local Greek artists. And here's the really cool part. They used genres like sci-fi and fantasy, not to escape the world, but as a Trojan horse to sneak in these incredibly sharp critiques of Greek politics and society.
So let's zoom in on one of these artists, Dimitris Vitalis. He was a master at capturing that deep philosophical pessimism of his generation.
Just take a look at his 1989 comic, Cheops. The setup is brilliantly bizarre. Two pilots from this super high-tech future get sucked through the Bermuda Triangle, and bam, they end up as slaves building the Great Pyramid for the pharaoh Cheops. But trust me, underneath all that sci-fi weirdness, there's a really powerful metaphor at play.
See, this was the ultimate Gen X trap. They felt totally crushed between two massive forces. On one side, the heavy burden of Greece's ancient, glorious past, and on the other, the pull of this kind of empty, westernized future. And in Cheops, both the past and the future are a prison. There's just no way out. He hits on this same idea again in another comic, Z17. In this one, a professor makes the discovery of a lifetime. He finds an alien element in our DNA that is the very thing that makes us human. But just as he gets close to this incredible truth, the aliens show up to, well, take it away. And the aliens' parting words? Man, they are just dripping with Gen X cynicism. This idea that the universe itself is basically designed to keep you in the dark, that the second you get close to some big capital T truth, you'll be punished for it. It's the perfect expression of that generation's deep distrust of any and all grand ideas. All right, let's switch gears to our next artist. Because where Vitalis was all philosophical and existential, an artist named Soloúp was just a razor-sharp political satirist. Okay, now get this premise.
His most famous character was Anthropologos, which means man-wolf. It's a total reverse werewolf story. You have this sensitive, intellectual, vegetarian wolf who gets bitten by a crude, brutish human and is now cursed to turn into a man every full moon.
The man-wolf immediately became this icon for Greek Gen X. He was the thoughtful, sensitive soul who was forced to deal with the ugly, corrupt, human world of 1980s Greece. He perfectly represented their feeling of being an outsider in their own society.
And Soloúp did not pull any punches. His comics went right after real-world scandals, from massive political corruption to police brutality. He even poked fun at the older generation of leftists who he felt had sold out their ideals. I mean, this was incredibly brave, super pointed, and deeply political stuff.
So when you put these artists and their work together, you start to see this really clear picture emerge, a picture of a generation that was defined by its own contradictions. And this is where it gets really fascinating, this paradox. A typical Greek circer could be obsessed with the Rolling Stones and American beatnik poets, but at the same time, they'd be out in the streets protesting the American embassy. They were soaking up global youth culture while also holding on to this deep resentment over things like the CIA's role in supporting the old dictatorship.
And that's exactly why comics were the perfect medium for them. The panels could hold all these conflicting ideas at once without needing to solve them. They were a mirror for a generation that was cynical but also idealistic, that was totally globalized but also fiercely nationalist.
So at the end of the day, what looks like just a little niche corner of pop culture was actually this incredibly important space for a whole generation to work through its identity crisis. By using sci-fi and satire, these artists weren't trying to escape reality. They were grabbing it by the throat and staring it right in the face.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to chew on. If these comics were the perfect mirror for Greek Gen X, reflecting all their contradictions and anxieties, what's our mirror today? What art form out there right now is capturing the strange paradoxes of our own time? Definitely something to think about.